Right now, in the private boardrooms of Paris, Milan, and New York, some of the most powerful executives in the world are at war with each other. Not over a patent, not over a merger, not over a piece of real estate, over en person. A 27-year-old woman from a small city in Thailand. And we're not talking about the soft competition of brand rivalry. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars in signed deals, about products that disappear from shelves within hours of her appearing in them, about a single social media post generating more earned media value than most mid-sized companies spend on advertising across an entire fiscal year. This is a war over something rarer than any luxury good money can buy. This is a war over cultural authority. The woman at the center of it all? Lisa. If you're not embedded in the world of K-pop or high fashion, you might be asking an entirely reasonable question right now. Who? Good. That question is exactly why this story is worth telling. Because Lisa, full name Lalisa Manobal, doesn't achieve fame the way most famous people do. She doesn't dominate American tabloids or appear on late-night sofas or require the scaffolding of Hollywood infrastructure to remain relevant. She doesn't need any of that. Her influence operates on a different frequency. One that legacy media hasn't fully figured out how to measure. One that the luxury industry, however, understood very quickly and very clearly. By the time this video ends, you'll understand exactly why brands that took decades, in some cases centuries, to build their identities are willing to restructure their entire marketing philosophy around one person. You'll understand the data. You'll understand the demographics. And you'll understand why this is not a story about pop music at all. It is a story about money, geography, and where the world's economic power is moving next. Let's start. Not at Lisa's beginning, but at the industry's. Because before we establish why Lisa is worth what she's worth, there's a story behind one of her most famous partnerships, a deal that nearly collapsed before it was announced, for reasons that exposed a deep and embarrassing fault line within the luxury world itself. We'll get to that in Chapter 3. It changes the way you read everything that happened after. Chapter 1. The new currency of influence. 10 years ago, luxury brand ambassadors looked a very specific way. European, usually. Often white. Aristocratic by birth, or convincingly so by image. The logic was simple, and it had worked for generations. Luxury derives its power from exclusivity. If you want your brand to feel aspirational, you attach it to someone who already inhabits the aspiration. Someone who the consumer looks at and thinks, that is a world I want access to. Think Audrey Hepburn for Givenchy, the golden age of the supermodel. The mythology of Parisian elegance and the particular vocabulary of old-world European refinement that luxury houses cultivated like a protected species. That formula worked beautifully for about 60 years. Then it stopped working. Here's what happened. Between 2010 and 2020, the global center of gravity for luxury consumption shifted, not incrementally, but dramatically. McKinsey and the Business of Fashion projected that by 2025, Chinese consumers alone would account for roughly half of all global luxury spending. Fold in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and you're looking at a region that moved from the periphery of the luxury world's imagination to the engine of its actual growth in less than a decade. The brands that recognized this early enough started winning. The ones that didn't started losing ground, they'll spend the next 20 years trying to recover. But here's the thing about demographic data. You can't just point at a map and tell your marketing department to sell there now. You need a cultural translator, someone who belongs to those markets from the inside, who is trusted by them in a way that no advertising campaign can manufacture, and who simultaneously carries weight in the West because the luxury world still partly calibrates value through a Western credibility signal, whether it wants to admit that or not. That intersection, genuine Southeast Asian cultural authority plus authentic Western fashion legitimacy, is extraordinarily rare, vanishingly rare. A traditional celebrity endorsement in 2014 was measured by blunt instruments, magazine covers, awards, follower counts. Brand awareness lift from a major celebrity campaign typically ran somewhere between 7 and 15%. Respectable. Predictable. By 2023, the metrics had sharpened into something far more granular and demanding. Brands now track earned media value, the dollar equivalent of all the organic press, social shares, and unsolicited coverage a campaign generates beyond its paid budget. They track sell-through velocity, how fast a product moves after an ambassador posts about it. They track follower acquisition in the 48-hour windows after a campaign drops. When those metrics are applied to Lisa's partnerships, they break the scale. A single Bvlgari post, an Instagram image, The resulting earned media coverage generated figures, per industry analysts who track the campaign, that rival what some entire mid-size luxury brands spend on advertising across a full calendar year. Not a year's campaign. One post, 48 hours. This is the new currency of influence. It isn't fame alone. It isn't beauty alone. It isn't even talent, though she has all three in excess. It's the ability to move economies. You might be thinking, celebrities sell things. This is nothing new. What's new is the scale, the precision, and, most critically, the geography. The brands pursuing Lisa aren't gambling on a trend. They're making some of the most calculated, data-backed investments in the history of luxury marketing. And to understand why she specifically was chosen, not some other globally famous entertainer, but her, you have to understand who she actually is. Chapter 2. Who is Lisa, really? Lalisa Manobal was born on March 27, 1997, in Buriram Province, a small city in northeastern Thailand, far from any entertainment industry, far from any obvious runway to global stardom. She was not born into a powerful family in the music world. She was not connected. She did not have the structural advantages that most people in her eventual position arrived with. What she had was physical precision, instinct, and an unusually early certainty about what she wanted. At 13 years old, she auditioned for YG Entertainment, one of South Korea's 3 dominant music labels, during an open casting call held in Bangkok. Thousands of young people showed up across those auditions. One was selected for the Seoul training program. That was Lisa. What followed was 4 years inside one of the most demanding talent development systems on Earth. K-pop training is not glamorous. It is not particularly kind. Trainees spend years in daily vocal, dance, language, and performance coaching with no guarantee they will ever debut. No promise that any of it will result in anything other than a very difficult education and a one-way ticket home. Many wash out. Many are quietly let go after being deemed not ready. Lisa didn't just survive that system. She did something almost without precedent. As a Thai national in an industry that had, until that point, no real template for non-Korean members of top-tier girl groups, she became the trainee that everyone in the building watched. In 2016, she debuted as part of Blackpink, a 4-member group that would go on to become the most subscribed music act in YouTube's history, the first K-pop group to headline Coachella, and by any serious metric, a genuine global cultural phenomenon. Within Blackpink, Lisa was the main dancer and lead rapper. Technically, she was exceptional. But what the fashion and luxury world noticed wasn't purely technical. It was something harder to quantify and considerably more valuable. Stop for a moment and think about what screen magnetism actually is. Most performers have it in one context and lose it in another. A theater actor who compresses on film. A musician who is electric on stage and flat in a campaign shoot. A celebrity who is magnetic in person and somehow ordinary in a photograph. Lisa's screen magnetism doesn't compress. It doesn't depend on format. It translates identically whether you're watching her on a stadium stage in Seoul, in a campaign image on a billboard in Times Square, in a 15-second clip on a phone in Jakarta, or in a full editorial spread in a European fashion magazine. For a luxury brand running a global, multi-format campaign, one that needs to hold its authority from a full-page print spread in Paris to a compressed thumbnail on an app in Manila, that quality is worth something that cannot easily be priced. And the industry started pricing it anyway. In 2021, Lisa released her first solo material. The music itself broke streaming records. But what the brand analytics teams noticed was something else. Her social metrics during that week behaved in ways the modeling tools weren't built to predict. Engagement rates that typically drop after a debut cycle spiked and held. Comments poured in across 7, 8, 9 languages simultaneously, with no single market dominating. She wasn't just a pop star. She was a multi-market activation event. And then the phone calls started in earnest. Chapter 3. The brand war begins. It started with Celine. In 2019, the French fashion house, founded in 1945, relaunched under creative director Hedi Slimane in 2018, named Lisa as a global ambassador. Understand the weight of that sentence in context. Celine is not a house that chases trends. It is a brand defined by deliberate restraint, by rigorous aesthetic control, by a very particular kind of Parisian cool that has always been reluctant to explain itself to anyone who doesn't already understand it. For a house operating under that self-image to partner with a K-pop artist, any K-pop artist, was, by the standards of heritage luxury, an almost radical act. So why Lisa, and why then? Understanding that requires understanding what Celine needed in 2019. Sliman's redesign of the brand had polarized the fashion world. Critics were divided. Longtime loyalists were uncertain. The house needed to establish itself as genuinely relevant to a new generation of consumers, young, globally distributed, digitally fluent, without sacrificing the aura of exclusivity that gives Celine its value in the first place. Lisa was the bridge. She had impeccable aesthetic credibility within the world of K-pop, a world where visual style is taken with extraordinary seriousness, and where millions of followers are watching what artists wear as closely as they're watching what they perform. She had a fan base that was global, aspirational, and, critically, of a demographic age that Celine needed to reach. And she wore clothing with a naturalness that cannot be trained into a person. She had it, or she didn't. She had it. The commercial results were measurable and swift. Celine's social following surged in Asian markets, South Korea, Japan, China, and across Southeast Asia. Google search interest for the brand in Thailand alone spiked beyond any seasonal projection. Product lines featured in Lisa's appearances sold through at rates that outperformed the house's global averages. She hadn't merely promoted the brand. She had extended its geographic reach into markets that traditional Celine campaigns had never penetrated with that kind of velocity. Then came Bvlgari. The Italian jeweler, founded in Rome in 1884, had always occupied the upper register of the luxury world. Its client list historically skewed older, wealthier, and predominantly Western. By the mid-2010s, like many heritage houses, Bvlgari was navigating the same generational transition. How does a brand that built its identity around old-world glamour stay aspirational for people who have never set foot in a Roman flagship store and may never plan to? Lisa was named a global ambassador in 2021. The campaign imagery, her face placed alongside some of the house's most storied jewelry pieces, became some of the most widely circulated luxury campaign images of that year. Not because Bvlgari paid for that distribution, because millions of people voluntarily shared them. Here's one number that clarifies what this actually means economically. The earned media value generated by Lisa's Bvlgari announcement in the first 48 hours alone, not the campaign's full run, just the announcement window, was reported by brand analytics firms tracking the coverage to exceed the total annual advertising spend of a typical mid-size luxury brand. One announcement, 48 hours. That's not just impressive return on investment. That's a categorically different kind of return on investment. There's a meaningful difference between a brand paying to place its name in front of people and a brand having millions of people voluntarily choose to become its distribution network. The economics of those two things are not comparable. They don't belong in the same conversation. Then there's MAC Cosmetics. MAC had built its identity around professional-grade makeup with an inclusive, unapologetic attitude. The brand's partnership with Lisa connected it to an audience with precise, sophisticated aesthetic taste, a group that buys intentionally and talks about what it buys loudly. Products tied to that collaboration sold out across multiple markets within hours of release. In some regions, they became temporarily impossible to source at any price. But none of this, none of the signed deals, none of the sold-out campaigns, came without friction behind the scenes. Because behind one of Lisa's most high-profile luxury partnerships, a deal nearly fell apart. Not over the fee, not over creative direction, over something more structural and in some ways more revealing, a conflict about how legacy luxury brands were, or weren't, prepared to work with Asian talent at the ambassador level. The specifics are not fully in the public record. What has been reported by fashion industry journalists and insiders who cover these negotiations is that certain houses were slow, operationally, to adapt their partnership frameworks to the realities of working with someone of Lisa's profile. Contracts that had been designed for a previous era of Western celebrity endorsements didn't translate cleanly. Territorial approvals, usage rights, creative control provisions, the scope of brand integration all became friction points. Not because either side was acting in bad faith, but because the machinery of luxury deal-making had been built for a different kind of deal. The brand that adapted its framework, that came to the table with flexibility rather than expecting Lisa's team to compress into an existing template, won the deal. The brand that moved more slowly lost it to a competitor. We'll close this thread in the next chapter. Because the reason the deal was ultimately saved, the specific understanding that shifted the internal dynamic, has everything to do with what Lisa's audience actually represents. And that audience is the most important part of the entire story. Chapter 4. The Blackpink Effect versus the Lisa Effect. Blackpink, as a group, is genuinely extraordinary by any serious commercial measure. Their YouTube channel holds the record for the most subscribed music act in the platform's history. Their concert tours fill stadiums across multiple continents. Their combined social footprint runs into the hundreds of millions of followers. When Blackpink does something, the coverage is global and immediate. And yet, when luxury brand analytics teams sit down and run the individual member data, region by region, platform by platform, demographic by demographic, something consistently interesting emerges. Lisa's numbers separate. Not in total volume. All 4 members of Blackpink are globally famous, and each has a commercial footprint that most entertainers never approach. But in geographic distribution, there is a distinction that changes the value calculation for luxury brands entirely. Lisa's fan base is disproportionately concentrated in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, markets that collectively represent more than 650 million people and an emerging middle class that is, by every serious economic projection, the fastest-growing luxury consumer cohort on Earth through 2030 and beyond. Let's stop here, because this number deserves its full weight. The global luxury goods market was valued at approximately $370 billion in 2023. Bain & Company projects that the Asia-Pacific region, led by China, with Southeast Asia accelerating at a pace that is changing the underlying math, will account for the dominant share of incremental luxury market growth through the end of this decade. These are not emerging markets in the patronizing, speculative sense that phrase used to imply. These are the growth engine of the entire industry. And brands that don't establish cultural resonance in those markets now, while the next generation of luxury consumers is forming its preferences and loyalties, will spend the following decade trying to buy back relevance at a much higher price. For a luxury house trying to enter Southeast Asian markets meaningfully, Lisa is not a marketing choice. She is a market entry strategy. The cost of building organically, through conventional advertising, PR investment, retail expansion, and years of brand building, the kind of trust and cultural resonance that Lisa already carries in that region would run into tens of millions of dollars at minimum, over many years, with no guarantee of success. Working with her is, by comparison, the most efficient path that currently exists. But here's the dimension that makes the mathematics genuinely exceptional, and this is the specific understanding that resolved the partnership conflict we laid out in the last chapter. Lisa doesn't just hold Southeast Asian cultural authority. She simultaneously carries genuine, hard-earned credibility in Western markets. Her presence at European fashion weeks, her features in Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and Vanity Fair, her visibility in the vocabulary of high fashion on a global basis. These give her a legitimacy signal in Europe and North America that most Southeast Asian entertainers, however beloved at home, have not yet built. She holds both sides of that axis at once. When the luxury house that had initially been reluctant finally understood this, truly understood it, not as an abstract demographic argument, but as a strategic reality for their own growth targets, the internal resistance evaporated. A revised framework was negotiated quickly because the senior decision-makers had finally run the correct calculation. They weren't looking at a regional celebrity with a large fan following. They were looking at a figure who moved with genuine authority on both sides of the fastest-shifting economic divide in the world. The moment that perception shifted, the deal was done. And that geographic bridge, the dual market credibility, the East-West axis command, is why the brand war around Lisa isn't cooling down. It's accelerating. Because that particular combination of influence is not something that can be manufactured or purchased or assembled from parts. It either exists or it doesn't. Right now, it exists in very few people on Earth with anything like Lisa's scale. Chapter 5. What this means for the future of luxury. Step back from Lisa for a moment, because the larger story, the one with the real long-term consequences, isn't actually about her at all. It's about a reckoning that the luxury industry has been managing to avoid for roughly a decade, and which it can no longer defer. The traditional model of luxury was built on a very specific mythology. Value derives from scarcity. Desirability derives from the approval of a narrow European aesthetic establishment. The brands that succeeded for a century did so by maintaining absolute control over who carried their name and what image those associations projected. Always upward, always toward a particular vision of European refinement as the terminal destination of good taste. That model assumed a fixed global hierarchy of cultural authority, Europe at the center, everyone else at the periphery. That assumption is now structurally incorrect. The next generation of significant luxury consumers is not primarily European. It is not primarily Western. And, this is the part that changes everything, it does not automatically inherit the taste hierarchies of the generation before it. It builds its own. And it builds those hierarchies around cultural icons it has chosen for itself. Not figures the industry approved of. Not people with the right genealogy or the right zip code or the right accent. Figures who earned trust through genuine, sustained, culturally resonant attention. Figures who represent something true about an experience the audience recognizes. Lisa is the most visible example of this structural shift. But she is not the only data point, and she is not the last one. The most sophisticated luxury executives in the world are watching what has happened with her partnerships. And they are running the same calculation across other regions, other demographics, other emerging creative economies. The question being debated in strategy meetings in Paris and Milan right now is not, how do we find another Lisa? The question is, who is the equivalent figure in West Africa, where a population of over 1 billion people is building its own cultural authority and beginning to generate meaningful luxury demand? In Brazil, where the luxury market is expanding rapidly into a population of extraordinary creative energy and cultural output? In the Arab world, where sovereign wealth and a young, globally connected consumer class are reshaping what aspiration looks like? The brands that correctly identify and commit to those figures before their competitors do. That's where the next decade of luxury market share gets decided. This matters even if you've never spent $1 on a luxury item and never plan to. Because the brands fighting this battle are not just competing for revenue. They're setting a cultural agenda. They're deciding whose image gets amplified at scale, whose story gets told in the most prestigious editorial contexts in the world, whose aesthetic gets to define what aspiration looks like for millions of people in the years ahead. That is a form of power that goes well beyond business. The luxury industry is learning, slowly, somewhat reluctantly, occasionally kicking against the lesson, that the future doesn't look like its past. The heritage still carries value. The craftsmanship still matters. The mythology is not dead, but it can only survive if it's carried by the right voices. Voices that can speak with authority to both sides of the world at once. Voices that millions of people trust before a brand says a single word. Right now, there is one person on Earth doing that more effectively and at more scale than anyone else. But the question that's keeping brand strategists awake at night isn't who that person is today. It's who they'll be tomorrow, and which brands will be humble enough, clear-eyed enough, and fast enough to find them first. If you stayed through all of that, you now understand something that gets missed in almost every piece of coverage about celebrity brand deals. This isn't about fame as an end in itself. It isn't about beauty or star power or how many followers someone has. The real story is about geography, about where the world's economic center of gravity is moving, and how fast. Lisa didn't become valuable to these brands because she's famous. She became valuable because she is famous in exactly the right places, at exactly the moment that those places are becoming the most important consumer markets on Earth, while simultaneously holding credibility in the Western markets that still partly set the agenda. She is a bridge between two economic worlds at the precise moment those worlds are converging. The brands that understood that early didn't just get a celebrity face for their campaigns. They bought a seat at the table for the most consequential consumer market transition of the next 20 years. Here's the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want to see your answer in the comments below. If you were running one of these legacy luxury houses right now, with the resources, the heritage, and the stakes they're operating under, which region would you look to next? What kind of cultural figure? What does the next version of this story look like? Drop it below. I read everything. If this kind of analysis, the real commercial logic underneath the cultural stories everyone is talking about, is something you want more of, subscribe. Because the next video goes inside another billion-dollar brand decision that the fashion press hasn't fully explained. You won't want to miss it.